Rachel. We read this morning from the Old Testament book of Esther, and we're going to start in chapter 3, read a few verses there, then go over to the 4th chapter. On the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. Then in the 4th chapter, when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. Hakak went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of this royal province know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and destruction and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away, carried out all of Esther's instructions. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. This is a fascinating story, to be sure. It's not one without its controversies. To start with, there's not a single mention of God or God's name in this book, either the first one given to Moses at the burning bush, Yahweh, I am who I am, or even the more generic term Elohim, an oddly plural word for a singular supreme being, by the way. Likewise, some will say there's next to nothing in this book that would commend it as a specifically religious text. There's no mention of Jerusalem or of the temple. There's no recognition of the dietary laws which should have governed Jewish behavior in a foreign land, as they did for Daniel, who was also in the Persian court some years earlier. What's more, you have to question just a little bit, at least, why Esther and her cousin Mordecai are even still in Babylon. For we find them there in the winter capital of Susa, some 50 years after Cyrus the Great issued his decree in 539 BC, allowing the Jews who had been exiled to that strange land by the Babylonians for 7 decades to go back home and rebuild Jerusalem at Persian expense, no less. So it's no wonder that over the years, many folks have thought this little book of Esther shouldn't even be in the Bible. For the first 700 years of the Christian church, there was not a single commentary written on this book. Calvin never preached from it at all. Maybe that should be a warning to me this morning. And Luther said of this book, I wish it had not come to us at all. But on the other hand, the great Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides ranked Esther equal to the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses in the Old Testament. He said all the other books may pass away, but Torah and Esther will abide forever. And sure enough, for more than 2,000 years, this little book has been read annually in synagogues all over the world. Not just read, but acted out. For the festival of Purim, which begins March 9th this year, stems out of this story. It's perhaps the most fun and joy-filled celebration of the whole Jewish year. People dress up in all kinds of costumes, for instance. I took a confirmation class once to a synagogue on the north side of town, and after having lectured them ever so severely about dressing nicely and paying attention, we went not knowing it was Purim, only to have the rabbi show up in a Star Trek uniform with even a Star Trek kippah, yarmulke on his head. And just about every other girl there, from age 5 to 95, was dressed up like Esther. What's more, when my good Methodist kids came in, again having been warned ever so severely to be on their best behavior, they handed them noisemakers so that they could participate in the telling of the story and make a racket and boo whenever the name of Haman was said. See, even though God may not be mentioned specifically in this book, the story of Esther has God's fingerprints all over it, I think. This is a story about how God fulfills his covenantal promises, even when we have no clue how he's going to do it. And even though Esther gets top billing in this tale, as she should, it's equally a story about two other men, a Jew named Mordecai and an Agagite named Haman, neither one of whom belonged in a Persian court at all. Now, just in case your memory of the Agagites is a little fuzzy, let me hasten to clarify that an Agagite is not just a more formal name for folks whom we call Aggies here in Texas. Totally different. Agag was a king of the Amalekites, whom we meet back in Exodus 17. They were the first people to attack Israel while they were making their way out of Egypt and ready to enter the promised land. We referenced them last week, in fact, when we remembered the story of Moses holding up his arms during a battle against these Amalekites. He held them up for so long that Aaron and Hur had to help hold them up. And at the end of Exodus 17, what we read is that this was the beginning of an enmity that was to last from generation to generation. So sure enough, by the time of Saul, those Amalekites under their new king Agag were still a problem. Saul was told to totally destroy them, but he failed to do so. So accordingly, centuries later, here we find one of Agag's descendants, Haman, which sounds a bit like the Hebrew word for wrath, serving the Persian king Ahasuerus, or as he was known by his Greek name, Xerxes. When it came to the Hebrews, Haman, the Agagite, still wouldn't let go of that old hatred, even in a foreign land. He was even willing to pay 10,000 talents of silver out of his own pocket to the king if he would allow him to exterminate them. That's $2.5 million, if you're doing the math. On the other hand, there was Mordecai. We don't know much about him. Only that he too had managed somehow to get himself into that inner circle of the Persian king's council. Maybe that's why he and Esther were still in Persia when they probably should have gone back home to Israel with the others decades earlier. Mordecai clearly knew how to handle himself when it came to politics. He's celebrated in Judaism today as a wise and noble man, a national hero, in fact. But we should notice that he was the one who originally insisted that his cousin Hadassah, whom he had raised since her parents had died, conceal her Jewish identity from everybody else, even renaming her after a Persian god, Astarte, calling her Esther. We don't know his motive for doing that. Maybe it was as simple as going along to get along. For likewise, Hadassah or Esther seemed more than willing to play along, even entering a kind of royal beauty contest in which the winning prize was to become the new queen. She had to go through 12 months of beauty treatments for that, if you can imagine. And then offer herself to Xerxes, a tall and handsome ruler who, according to historians, was also a rather jealous lover. It's no wonder thus that one commentator on this book, Karen Jobes, has marked on the disquieting moral ambiguity at best at the way Esther and Mordecai are portrayed in this book. Yet ultimately, this story goes beyond what either Mordecai or Esther or even Haman tried to do. For the real protagonist of this tale is the God who is never mentioned by name in it. See, this is an amazing illustration of the providence of God. That's a term we don't use much anymore. It's a great one. Webster defines it as farsightedness, forethought, vision, specifically the protective care of God as a spiritual power. In Lutheran theology, divine providence refers to God's cooperation with everything that happens, his care of creation, his guiding of the universe. What it means in application is that God governs all creation. He oversees all actions and circumstances. And not just in an overtly miraculous way, like as when Jesus stilled the water of the storm or raised the dead, but through the normal and ordinary course of human life, the unfolding of daily events, however they may present themselves to us. You see, we can believe that what happens to us in life is the product of providence, or we can write it off as simply coincidences. But my experience with God over a lifetime has led me to conclude that there's really no such thing as coincidences at all. Many years ago in Beatrice, Nebraska, the West Side Baptist Church was holding choir rehearsal, as it always did, starting at 7:30 on a Wednesday night. Usually the choirs arrived long before the start time, but that night, one by one and two by two, they all had excuses for being late. Marilyn, the church pianist, overslept on her after-dinner nap. So she and her mother were late. One girl, a high school sophomore, had trouble with her homework, so that delayed her. She was late. One couple couldn't get their car started. They were supposed to pick up another couple, so all four of them were late. Even the pastor and his wife were late. Everybody had a good excuse, but at 7:30, the time the choir practice was supposed to start, for the first time ever, there was not one soul in that church. That night was also the night in which there was a gas leak in the basement of the West Side Baptist Church. Precisely at 7:30, the church furnace blew up right below the choir loft, ignited a gas leak. The whole church was destroyed. Nobody was injured because nobody was there. And you could call that a coincidence, if you like. And I know it doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes there's a deeper plan of God that we will not understand this side of heaven. But when I read this story of Esther, I'm struck again by the incredible number of coincidences that are sprinkled throughout it. In chapter 2, we read Mordecai just happened to find out about a conspiracy to assassinate the king, and he was able to get a warning to Xerxes through Esther, saving his life. All that was written down in the royal annals. In chapter 6, after Haman's murderous decree to kill all the Jews had been issued, Xerxes just happened to be unable to sleep one night, and he asked, "Bring me something to read." They brought him those annals, and he began reading them and was reminded of what Mordecai had done. He just happened to ask Haman, who was the only man around of all people, what should be done to honor a man whom the king favors, and Haman thought he was talking about himself, so he laid out all kinds of honors. And then before he knew it, Xerxes told Haman, "Go get Mordecai and give him all those honors." Kind of awkward, huh? Haman began to figure out he was in trouble, but he couldn't even get out of town before the king's messengers arrived to bring him to a banquet which Esther had prepared for both Xerxes and Haman. It was at that dinner when she told the king what Haman was planning to do, to destroy, kill, annihilate all of the Jews. 3 different verbs used here in chapter 3, verse 13. Xerxes left the room in a rage. You can read about it in chapter 7. And when Haman tried to beg Queen Esther for his life, he fell off the couch into her lap just as Xerxes happened to come back into the room. And remember that part about Xerxes being a jealous lover? At once, Xerxes ordered that the pole which Haman had erected to impale Mordecai be used on Haman himself. And so it was. But don't miss the point here. It wasn't just all a coincidence. And there were no overt miracles. But it was God's providence being revealed in the unfolding of events. And dear friends, if we have the eyes to see it, we will discover the providence of God unfolding in our lives as well. Secondly, however, we ought not to negate what Esther did. She not only displayed tremendous courage, she demonstrated what the power of choice can do. Even though she was the queen, she wasn't free to simply sidle up to her husband anytime she wanted to. He had to send for her. And if she came unbidden, non vocatus, she was subject to death herself. She told Mordecai that, but he replied back, do not think that because you're in the king's household, you alone of all the Jews will escape, literally slip away. Listen again to what he said, though. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come for the Jews from another place. Another place. But you and your family will perish. And yet, who knows? I like it in Hebrew. Umi yodea. Who knows? But that you have come to your royal position. Literally, you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And I have to warn you, my friends, has God put us in this place at this time for a particular task as well? See, like Esther and Mordecai, we live in a completely pagan world, I think. There are Christian trappings around us. But in the culture, in case you haven't noticed, we're not exactly in sync with everybody else anymore, are we? So we face difficult moral and ethical questions every day, which call us from time to time at least to have to stand up for our values and for our principles. Ours is an age of indifference, for instance, which we no longer have any real common core convictions about things as truth and lying and right and wrong and good and bad. We live in a laissez-faire world whose watchword is the ubiquitous response, whatever. But sometimes whatever isn't a faithful answer to a question. Sometimes we need to speak in clarion terms, not in ambiguous answers. Sometimes we need to say no when those all around us are saying no problem. Do what you want to. Sometimes we all need to follow that Boy Scout oath to help other people, to keep ourselves physically strong, mentally awake, morally straight. Or as the Girl Scouts say, to be courageous and strong, to make the world a better place. And Esther reminds us that when we do that, we can make a genuine difference. Notice, however, that she also understood she wasn't alone. She told Mordecai, get everybody together, all the Jews in Susa, and fast and pray for me for 3 days. What an incredible act of faith. You pray for me, I'll go for us. And if you're being called today to speak out for what you believe is right, let other people know, and we'll pray for you as well. That's what it means to share our burdens, to carry a load, to be the body of Christ, one or the other, to be on a team that is the body of Christ. Sometimes we can only see him in the hands and in the feet of other believers. We mentioned earlier that one of the oddities of this book of Esther is that God is never named within it or even referenced. But here's the great paradox of Esther. God is omnipotently present even when God is most conspicuously absent. Long before the time of Esther and Mordecai, the enemy of God tried to abort his rescue plan to use the Hebrews to bring us all back into his fold. But God foiled the plans of Pharaoh to murder all the Hebrew children by plucking one of them out of the Nile and planting him in Pharaoh's household itself. His name was Moses. Then here in this story, God thwarted a second attempt at the genocide of the Jews by turning the tables on Haman the Agagite in Persia. Centuries later, it would be Herod the Great who tried to eliminate the baby born in Bethlehem by once again killing all the Hebrew boys under the age of 2. But Jesus and his family were warned to flee beforehand, and so they did. And within the living memory of some here today, there was yet another attempt to wipe out God's children in the final solution created by Adolf Hitler. 2 weeks ago was the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, International Holocaust Remembrance Day. But did you also know that the Nazis forbid that in that concentration camp and in others at Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and other places of horror, they were forbidden to even read the book of Esther while they were imprisoned? Maybe it was too close to home. Only in the dark days before their deaths, the Jewish inmates of those camps wrote the book of Esther from memory so that they could read it in secret when Purim came around that year. The Nazis did their best to blot out the presence of God, but like Pharaoh, like Haman, like Herod, in the end, they couldn't do so. And neither can the circumstances of any of our lives either. Whatever you may face this morning, be encouraged. Because even if you can't see him, God is still there. And like Esther, you still have the power of choice. You can decide to trust in him, knowing that even if you perish, you will have everlasting life. Because you're in the palm of God's hand, and John 10:28 reminds us, no one can snatch you from his hand. You can fall back upon the providence of God because it's real. And it's in each of our lives. I invite you to open your eyes this morning and look around. Who knows? Who knows but that you have come to your circumstances today. Perhaps even you were born for such a time as this. Amen.